Imagine standing on a continent that believes it has already decided its fate. By the summer of 1940, much of Europe felt exactly that way. Borders had collapsed faster than anyone expected. Armies once considered invincible had vanished in weeks. Capitals had fallen with barely a pause between disbelief and surrender. To many observers, the war already looked finished, not because peace had arrived, but because resistance seemed pointless. Germany's victories were not just military, they were psychological. Speed, coordination, and confidence created an illusion of inevitability. When France fell, it didn't feel like a defeat so much as a confirmation of something people had already begun to fear, that Europe no longer controlled its own destiny. Britain stood alone, defiant in public and desperate in private. The British Isles had not been invaded, but they were exposed. Supplies crossed oceans patrolled by submarines. Industry worked around the clock under the threat of air raids. Survival depended on endurance, not momentum. And beyond the Atlantic, America watched. At least, that's how it appeared. In reality, the story of why Europe could not win the Second World War without America begins long before a single American soldier landed on European soil, and even before the war itself began. It begins with capacity. Modern war is not decided by bravery alone. It is decided by what can be built, moved, repaired, replaced, and sustained over years of destruction. By the 20th century, victory depended less on heroic charges and more on invisible systems, logistics, fuel, food, steel, transportation, and time. Europe entered the war already strained by its own geography and history. Nations were close together, industrial centers vulnerable, supply lines short but fragile. Raw materials had to be imported or fought over. Losses could not be absorbed indefinitely. Germany understood this, which is why it tried to win quickly. Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic, it was a necessity. Germany did not have the luxury of a long war against the combined resources of the world. Speed was survival. But speed creates its own problem. If a war is not won quickly, the advantage reverses. And by late 1940, despite its victories, Germany had failed to deliver a knockout blow. Britain had not surrendered. The Soviet Union still existed, and across the Atlantic, the world's largest industrial economy remained untouched by bombs, invasion, or occupation. Officially, the United States was neutral. Psychologically, it was anything but passive. American leaders did not see the war as a distant European tragedy. They saw it as a slow-moving threat. Not immediate, not urgent, but inevitable. A continent dominated by a single hostile power would eventually reach across oceans, economically if not militarily. So, while public speeches spoke the language of neutrality, preparation had already begun. Factories expanded quietly, shipyards lengthened their slips, production lines were redesigned, not for peace, but for scale. This is where Europe's situation became unsustainable. Because Europe could fight, Europe could resist, Europe could sacrifice, but Europe could not replace loss at the rate modern war demanded. When tanks were destroyed, they had to be rebuilt under bombing. When aircraft were shot down, pilots could be trained faster than planes could be manufactured. When ships were sunk, the industrial base to replace them was under threat every single day. Across the Atlantic, none of those constraints existed. American factories were not under air attack. Rail lines ran without interruption. Ports operated at full capacity. Farmland stretched beyond the horizon untouched by shell fire. Oil flowed without the constant fear of cutoff. This difference did not show up immediately on the battlefield. At first, it appeared only in numbers, then in reliability, then in endurance. As the war dragged on, the question shifted from who could win battles to who could afford to keep fighting. Britain felt this first. Without external support, it faced a simple equation. Ships lost faster than ships built meant starvation within months. Ammunition expended faster than ammunition replaced meant eventual collapse. The Soviet Union would later face the same reality on an even larger scale. Men could be mobilized by the millions, but mobility without vehicles, supply without rail cars, and firepower without ammunition would turn mass armies into immobile targets. Europe was bleeding, courageously, repeatedly, but bleeding nonetheless. America, meanwhile, was accumulating, not just weapons, but systems. The ability to coordinate production across industries, the ability to move raw materials from one coast to another without interruption, the ability to standardize designs so they could be produced faster, repaired easier, and shipped further. This is the part of the war that is easy to overlook because it doesn't explode on camera, but it is the part that decides everything. By the time America formally entered the war, the outcome was no longer about whether Europe could defeat Germany alone. That possibility had already slipped away. The real question had become whether Europe could survive long enough for American capacity to fully engage, and that was not guaranteed. The Atlantic was still deadly, submarines still hunted, losses were still severe. There were moments when it seemed entirely possible that supplies would be cut, that Britain would choke, that the Soviet Union would collapse before relief could arrive in meaningful quantities. This was the narrowest point of the war, and it is here that the idea of inevitability collapses. Because Europe did not fail due to lack of will, it failed because modern war had outgrown its limits of its geography, its industry, and its resources. America did not save Europe in a single dramatic moment. It absorbed the war into a system that could sustain it longer than any enemy could endure. And once that happened, the balance was no longer recoverable. Germany could fight battles, it could inflict losses, it could delay defeat, but it could not match an opponent whose factories replaced entire armies while the front lines were still moving. By the end of 1941, the trajectory was set, even if the world had not yet realized it. Europe was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to hold on until something larger, farther away, and industrially unmatched could finish what courage alone could not. And that larger force was only just beginning to wake up.
The transformation did not announce itself with a single decision or declaration. There was no moment when the world clearly understood that the balance had shifted. Instead, it happened quietly through paperwork, contracts, ship manifests, and factory schedules. While Europe fought for survival, America began to reorganize itself around a single, overwhelming idea: scale. Not speed, not brilliance, scale. Before American troops ever entered combat, the United States had already begun supplying a war it was not officially fighting. Lend-Lease was not charity, and it was not generosity. It was strategy. It allowed America to project power without committing bodies, to shape the battlefield without firing shots. Britain was the first beneficiary, and also the first proof. Food arrived in quantities that reversed starvation curves. Fuel shipments stabilized naval operations. Aircraft losses could be absorbed rather than feared. Ships sunk by submarines were replaced faster than Germany could sink them. For the first time since 1940, Britain was no longer shrinking under pressure, it was stabilizing. That distinction mattered. Because modern war does not reward survival alone, it rewards recovery. And Europe, on its own, had no margin for recovery left. Factories in Britain worked tirelessly, but their output was capped by geography and vulnerability. German bombers did not need to destroy everything, only enough. A disrupted rail line, a damaged power station, a ruined dock could cascade into months of reduced output. Across the Atlantic, those same disruptions barely registered. American industry expanded without interruption. New factories were built while old ones were upgraded. Production lines were standardized so that workers could be trained quickly, parts could be swapped easily, and repairs could happen anywhere. This was not innovation in the romantic sense, it was brutal efficiency. Planes were designed not just to fly, but to be repaired in the field. Tanks were built not just to fight, but to be transported, fueled, and maintained at scale. Ships were simplified so they could be constructed faster, even if that meant sacrificing elegance. The goal was not perfection. The goal was replacement. Europe had been fighting a war of preservation. America prepared for a war of attrition, and that distinction sealed the outcome. The Soviet Union soon entered this equation, and with it came a scale of destruction unlike anything Europe had ever witnessed. Entire armies were lost in weeks, cities vanished, infrastructure collapsed, and yet the Red Army kept fighting. Not because it was self-sufficient, it wasn't, but because American supplies flowed eastward in volumes that defied imagination. Trucks that moved armies, rails that carried food, radios that coordinated units, boots that kept soldiers walking. These were not dramatic weapons. They did not win headlines, but they won time. And time, once secured, became irreversible. Without those supplies, Soviet resistance would have slowed, then stalled, then collapsed. Manpower without mobility is mass, not force. Courage without logistics is sacrifice without effect. Europe could bleed, America could replenish. This imbalance only grew as the war continued. Germany, meanwhile, faced an impossible equation. It fought on multiple fronts with an industrial base under constant attack. Oil shortages crippled movement. Aircraft were grounded not because of pilot shortages, but because fuel no longer existed in reliable quantities. Every loss hurt more than the last. By contrast, American losses triggered expansion, not contraction. When demand increased, output followed. When shipping lanes were threatened, more ships were built. When weapons wore out, replacements arrived before shortages could form. This is the moment when the war quietly crossed a threshold. After this point, victory without America was no longer improbable, it was structurally impossible. Not because Europeans lacked resolve, not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked margin. Modern war is unforgiving to systems that cannot absorb shock. Once losses exceed replacement, collapse is only a matter of time. By 1942, Germany was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to delay. Britain was no longer fighting to survive alone, it was fighting as a part of a system far larger than itself. The Soviet Union was no longer isolated, it was being fed, fueled, and transported by an industrial power beyond the reach of enemy bombers. The war had ceased to be European, it had become global, not just geographically, but industrially. And this shift altered everything. Planning changed. Commanders no longer asked whether they could afford an operation, but how long they could wait to improve conditions. Losses were calculated differently. Risk tolerance increased. Strategies that would have been reckless in 1940 became acceptable in 1943 because replacement had become reliable. This reliability reshaped morale in ways that are difficult to measure. Soldiers who know they will be resupplied fight differently than those who fear running out. Nations that can plan months ahead behave differently than those living shipment to shipment. Europe had lived on the edge of scarcity for years. America eliminated that edge. And once scarcity disappears, momentum becomes inevitable. Germany could still fight brilliantly. It could still surprise. It could still inflict terrible damage. But it could not reverse the flow of material that now surrounded it. Factories in the Ruhr were bombed, repaired, bombed again. Each cycle reduced output further. Meanwhile, factories in the Midwest expanded, unaffected by air raids, untouched by invasion. The gap widened every month. By the time American troops landed in large numbers, they arrived not as reinforcements to a struggling continent. They arrived as the visible edge of a force that had already decided the war in spreadsheets and shipping schedules. Europe did not lose because it was weak. Europe lost because the war it faced was larger than any continent could sustain alone. And America did not win because of a single battle or general. It won because it turned war into a process, one that could be repeated, scaled, and endured until opposition collapsed under its own limitations. By the time this became obvious to everyone involved, the outcome was already locked in. The only uncertainty left was how long the destruction would continue before the inevitable arrived.
By the final years of the war, the question of whether Europe could have won without America was no longer debated in command rooms. It had been settled by arithmetic, not ideology. Yet even now, decades later, the question still provokes discomfort, not because the answer is unclear, but because of what that answer implies. Europe's contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany was immense. Millions fought, millions died, cities were destroyed, entire societies were reshaped by trauma that would last generations. None of that disappears when America enters the story. But contribution and capacity are not the same thing. Courage does not substitute for fuel. Sacrifice does not replace steel. Experience does not manufacture aircraft. What makes this realization difficult is that it reframes heroism. It suggests that valor alone does not decide history, that systems do, and systems, unlike soldiers, do not inspire poetry. By 1943, German leadership understood this reality with brutal clarity. Internal reports acknowledged shortages that could not be solved. Oil reserves dwindled beyond recovery. Aircraft production rose on paper, but real operational capacity declined. Trained pilots died faster than replacements could be prepared. Entire divisions existed in name only. The war was no longer being lost at the front. It was being lost in warehouses, rail yards, refineries, and factories. Meanwhile, American output continued to rise, not because Americans were immune to sacrifice, but because the structure of their economy allowed loss to be absorbed without collapse. When one factory reached capacity, another was built. When labor shortages appeared, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. When shipping lanes were threatened, more ships were launched than could be sunk. This created a strategic environment that no European power, not even a united one, could match independently. The idea that Europe could have won alone often rests on counterfactuals: different decisions, faster offensives, better coordination, fewer mistakes. But these arguments misunderstand the nature of industrial war. Strategy matters, but only within the limits imposed by production and logistics. Once those limits are reached, no brilliance can compensate. Even if Germany had avoided certain errors, even if Britain had endured longer in isolation, even if the Soviet Union had mobilized more efficiently, the underlying imbalance would have remained. Europe was a battlefield. America was a factory. And factories decide wars of attrition. This does not diminish Europe's role, it clarifies it. Europe fought the war. America made it winnable. Without American involvement, the conflict might not have ended in German victory, but it would not have ended in decisive defeat either. It would have dragged on, consuming more lives, more cities, more generations. A negotiated settlement, a frozen conflict, or a fragmented continent dominated by exhaustion were far more likely outcomes than liberation. That possibility is rarely discussed because it is uncomfortable. It suggests that liberation was not inevitable, that freedom did not emerge naturally from resistance alone, that without external capacity, Europe's future might have been decided by limits rather than ideals. This realization also explains why the post-war world took the shape it did. American influence did not end with victory. It extended into reconstruction, currency stability, infrastructure, and political architecture. The Marshall Plan was not an afterthought. It was a continuation of the same logic that had won the war. Stability requires scale. Europe rebuilt, but it did so within a system designed and underwritten by American capacity. This did not erase European identity or agency, but it did redefine power relations in a way that persists to this day. And this is why the subject remains sensitive. Acknowledging that Europe could not win without America feels to some like diminishing sacrifice. To others, it feels like granting too much credit to industry and too little to blood. But history is not a moral ledger. It is a record of outcomes shaped by constraints. The Second World War was not decided by who wanted victory more. It was decided by who could afford it longer. America could. Europe alone could not. That truth does not insult the fallen. It explains them. It places their sacrifice within the reality they faced, a reality where bravery slowed defeat, but capacity determined victory. Understanding this does not make the war less meaningful, it makes it more honest. And perhaps that honesty is the most difficult legacy of all,
because it forces us to accept that in the modern world, survival depends on not only what a society believes, but on what it can sustain when belief is no longer enough. That lesson did not end in 1945. It merely changed its setting. And history, as always, continues to test whether we remember it or prefer the comfort of simpler stories.